Thank you. And I'll go ahead and let Jason and Abby introduce themselves, and I'll repost some of those links.
Okay, thanks, Ted. My name's Jason Peters. I met most of you hopefully on the last webinar that we had last week. And so I'm really excited about this group, and I'm excited to hear presentations from some of the other states. But of course, being one of the folks that helped get this idea off the ground, I volunteered to be the first one. So, feel free to critique me as you will. I'm joined with Abby Williams. She's our culture planting biologist. You say, hey, Abby.
Hi, everyone. Abby Williams here. I work with Jason on oyster reefs that we construct specifically for harvest, which he will get into more in the presentation.
So Abby's going to be my fact checker as I go through this. So if she has to chime in and tell me I'm spewing a bunch of BS, if you will, then don't be surprised. And on that note, what's that?
I said I'll do my best.
Yeah. So on that note, I'll go ahead and get started. Like I said, I'm going to give you a talk about our restoration and our oyster reef enhancement strategy here in North Carolina. And I'll point out one of my errors already. Feel free to critique, but I graduated with a science degree, not an English degree. So I apologize for my apostrophe there. Wasn't sure if the webinar belonged to us managers or not, but you can maybe forgive me later on. So let's see here. So I'm gonna just jump right into it. I work for the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries, so hopefully everybody on this call has seen a picture of North Carolina and knows where North Carolina is, but you may not be familiar with the geography here. In the West Coast, or excuse me, on the western part of the state, we've got what us East Coasters like to refer to as high mountains. They're actually the highest mountains east of the Mississippi, Mount Mitchell being the highest. That's in the far western part of the state. And then as we move east along the state, things sort of level out until we get to the coastal plain. And on the far eastern end of the state, it's bound or protected from the Atlantic Ocean by our barrier islands, most of you know as the Outer Banks. Being the Division of Marine Fisheries, we're really focused with those coastal counties, coastal waters on the eastern part. Little image here to the right of the coastal counties that bind or sort of envelop those coastal waters to which we are chartered with managing. So North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries, we're responsible for the stewardship of the state's marine and estuarine resources. Our jurisdiction encompasses all of those coastal waters and extends 3 miles offshore. Something perhaps unique or certainly different in the state of North Carolina is that our policies governing our marine resources are decided by a 9-member commission that is appointed directly by the governor. So that's under the executive branch. We are also a cabinet level. The Department of Environmental Quality is a cabinet level agency, so we also fall under the executive branch. But most of the appropriated funds, or really all of the appropriated funds, are dictated by our state legislature. So there's sometimes some communication that has to occur between those two branches in order to get things done. But we at the division don't actually make any rules or policies that apply to the general public in the form of fisheries rules. We just make recommendations to that panel. Just sort of a fun fact. More specifically, on the eastern side of the state, in our estuarine waters, we've got just over 12,000 miles of estuarine shoreline, so quite a bit of shoreline, 2.2 million acres of estuarine waters. Sort of north of the Morehead City area, which is, you might see on the image, Carteret County, sort of central coastal. North of there is the Albemarle-Pamlico estuarine system. It's bound to the east by the Outer Banks. That's a lagoonal estuary. It's the second largest in the United States behind the Chesapeake Bay. It is not influenced by lunar tides, wind tides only. There's quite a bit of salinity gradient moving from higher salinity in the east to lower salinity in the west. With the majority of our salinities falling sort of in a range between 10 and maybe the low to mid 20s parts per thousand. And so because of those moderate salinities and the fact that we do not have lunar tides in those areas, our oyster populations there are predominantly subtidal, with some few minor exceptions in the far extreme eastern portions of that system. Harvest in that area is allowed from mid-October to about the end of March through a couple of different methods: hand harvest, or hand tong, or mechanical methods as well, mostly in the form of dredge from a boat. Moving south of the Carteret County, Morehead City area, the estuarine waters are characterized as more shallow and narrow sounds. The barrier island comes very close to the mainland there, so very narrow waterway. There are lunar tides in this area and much higher salinities, and because of that, our oyster populations are predominantly intertidal, so a totally different animal, so to speak. Harvest in those areas, there's no mechanical methods allowed south of really the Morehead City area, but it's the same season, mid-October through mid-March, hand harvest only. So that should give you a little bit of context on what we're talking about here today and our systems in North Carolina. Restoration specifically here in our state, everyone should be well versed in all of the benefits that oysters offer, the ecosystem services and the economic benefits, so I won't belabor that. But specifically, why do we need to restore in North Carolina? Why do we need to build back? And it really starts with a history note on the oyster wars that occurred in the Chesapeake Bay region in the late 1800s. I'm no history buff, but I sometimes play one on TV. In the late 1800s, there was intensive harvest in the Chesapeake Bay, and it created tensions between their fisheries police. And because of that tension, many of the harvesters redirected their effort to North Carolina, and North Carolina experienced a significant uptick in harvest. Some would characterize as extreme overharvest. So on the left there, you see kind of a figure, and the Coastal Federation might recognize this one. I robbed it from one of their pages. Thanks. But really, the oyster wars you see on the left-hand side of that image, the oyster wars were sort of peak harvest, and we've never really recovered from that, oscillating from decade to decade with increases and decreases in harvest, but never really getting back to those peak harvest levels. We don't in North Carolina have a stock assessment. We never have. So we do use harvest as our litmus test or our indicator for our population status. Whether that's right or wrong is maybe something for a different discussion, but that's sort of what we look at. And in terms of harvest, we've never really recovered. Some of the factors are some factors that many of you will recognize, probably similar issues in your own states: coastal development, runoff, pollution, algal blooms and related low DO events, global climate change, which we've all experienced to some degree or another, either directly or indirectly, over harvest that I spoke about, and extreme weather events. So that's why we need to restore. And in North Carolina, since the early 1900s, we've taken an active approach, or an active stance in restoring and building back oyster reefs. Today, we've got a two-part approach. It consists of basically two programs: our Oyster Sanctuary Program, which is a closed harvest reef construction program, and then our Open Harvest Program, which is our culture planting. And I'm not going to get into living shorelines in this talk, but maybe that's something that we can discuss in the future. Not something that the division, my agency, really is active per se in developing. Rather, we focus on these two programs. So Oyster Sanctuary program is something that started in the mid-90s. Folks identified that we really needed more oyster larvae in our more northern portions of the coastal waters, Pamlico Sound being sort of the specific area of focus. So we started building these sanctuary sites, and the goal of these sanctuary sites, again, is to close the boundaries so that we can host high densities of oysters, so lots of oysters per unit area, and lots of really large oysters, with the goal of increasing the reproductive potential of that reef and supplying larvae through spillover and connectivity to other reefs that are open to harvest. So if you will, sort of a larval insurance policy, larval factory. We build these things with high complexity. They're really large, anywhere from, or what we consider to be really large, 40 to 80 acres, sometimes even bigger. They're high relief. We make them out of ridges, mounds, and patches. And we use a variety of material types ranging from large aggregate rock to engineered reef units, being your reef balls, recycled concrete pipe, precast concrete, and other materials. Because of the complexity and the size, these things are pretty expensive. So we invest a lot of money into them so that they'll be there for a really long time, and we design them that way. Again, to be sort of an insurance policy for us. The intent here is that they will never open up. They will always remain closed as sanctuary sites. On the flip side, we've got another program. It's our culch planting program. This is focused more coast-wide, so we operate in Pamlico Sound, but also in the other coastal waters, extending theoretically all the way to the South Carolina line, anywhere where oysters can live. The objective here is to restore available hard substrate to receive larvae from either other culch sites, other natural reef sites, or oyster sanctuaries in the case of Pamlico Sound. These are much smaller investments per acre. We use really small materials, and the general design is low complexity, low relief. We build them, we've got a fleet of our own equipment, 6 vessels, and I'll show you those in a little bit, that we use to build those reef sites. We order materials and deliver them to a variety of stockpile sites that we maintain throughout the state, then load those materials onto our fleet of vessels and deploy them in various locations. Strategy here is they're inexpensive, not much of a long-term investment, maybe 5 years or so before we start to see them disappear. But because they're less expensive, we can build more of them. So we build more acreage, more sites, culch sites versus sanctuary sites in a given year. So you can see some of these images just comparing the oyster sanctuaries to the culch reefs. The oyster sanctuaries in the upper left side there, you can see some of the reef design that we employ versus the culch planting sites in the lower right. That's a sort of those 3 images, the upper right of those 3 images in the lower right. That's a backscatter image showing the lighter colors being the hard substrate of a culch planting site. So that continuous veneer, washing the material off of a boat. A couple more images on the sanctuary and the culch planting site. I apologize for this small font there. Again, you can put me in editing jail. The sanctuaries, we've got 16 of them, about 400 acres total. The image, don't worry about the names of those sites, but just you can kind of see the spread in Pamlico Sound, how they're kind of spread out, and that's by design, so that we can really maximize the benefit of those that those sites are providing to other oyster habitats throughout the Sound. In the center part of that upper 3 images is a 3-dimensional bathymetric survey shot. you can see just in the color ramp, the differences in height and sort of the elongated ridges that we build with contractor equipment. And you'll see a photo of the contractors on the upper right there deploying those materials. We need to use contractors for that because of the scale of the operation, the volume of material, and the size of the material is not something that we can accommodate with our own equipment here at the division.
Jason,
Yes.
apologize for interrupting. This is Ted. There's a question. I don't know the first name, but Mr. Tomlin has a question. You want to take questions during your presentation? You want to wait to the end?
How about I get through it and then I can answer questions at the end, and that way
Okay.
maybe there's an opportunity to address it in the future slides.
All right.
That was
Thanks.
my question. Thank you.
Sure. So the bottom three images there are just pictures of our culture planting program. You can see us loading materials with a conveyor onto a barge. That barge goes out to somewhere relatively close to the stockpile site within 10 miles or so, and then we wash it off with a high pressure water monitor to build these sort of thin veneer reefs that you see on the lower right. We've got hundreds of these, maybe thousands statewide. Really, we've got them documented really well back to the early 80s, but before that, some issues with GPS and LORAN and record keeping, and we've kind of lost track of where a lot of those were originally deployed, but at least hundreds of them, if not thousands, from the 80s on. Now, a little on oyster sanctuaries. These guys, once again, they're the closed harvest sites that are designed to host lots of oysters in high density and large oysters so that we can maximize the reproductive potential. These are a little more than just a build it and they will come approach. There's a lot that goes into siting these guys because of the longevity that we anticipate or that we're targeting. And we want them to have the ability to host those oysters for a long time. So we use a variety of siting tools. The top one on this list is a habitat suitability index model. It's developed by the North Carolina State University. It uses a variety of data sources that sort of overlay one another and give a score per unit area in our estuarine waters. And it helps us really get a search window for where we start to pick our sites. It looks at historical oyster populations. It looks at water quality metrics. And it looks at things like navigation corridors and bottom type salinity. And that really helps us hone in. And then we sort of validate that against our own data, side scan data, like frequency data, population data, our own water quality monitoring and historical marine pest data. And once we've looked at all of those data sources, we hone in on a place that we're going to go out and search, and then we ground truth it in the field. Once we've ground truthed it and we've honed in on a site, we'll gather some public input on whether or not we think, or the general public thinks it's a good idea to site a reef there. And then we pull the trigger and build. Our material acquisition process is typically ordering from a local quarry. It's delivered to our stockpile sites via dump truck, and then loaded onto a contractor barge and deployed. Now, once it's deployed, we have fairly rigorous monitoring in the state here. We maintain a dive team that does most of our at least biological monitoring via diver observation and excavations. We're looking at population demographics, things like length, frequency, and such, growth, mortality, those simple population demographics. We also do some physical surveys, side scan being one of them, to map out the reef site and map changes over time due to sedimentation or just general loss to harvest in the case of culture planting. And then we now analyze temporal and spatial trends in those and apply those trends and what we've learned to siting new reefs or developing enhancement priorities or perhaps even enforcement needs. Just a little case study or showing you what we're working on here lately is our Cedar Island Oyster Sanctuary is our most recent one. Apologize, this slide's a little old. We've built another year onto this, but it gives you an idea of how we're building these sites. Every year, we're doing about 18,000 tons of material, building roughly 20 or so acres per shot, 15 to 20 acres per year. Not going to get too much into the science, but oyster sanctuaries may or may not be a new concept to some. But really just showing you some of the figures, some evidence as to how we know that oyster sanctuaries are successful as far as providing that larval subsidy. So I mentioned we want sanctuaries to host lots of oysters and lots of large oysters. Well, the image on the far left, just as a comparison of oyster population density per square meter, looking at the difference between natural reefs, culture planted reefs, and oyster sanctuaries or reserves as it's labeled in this figure. And you can see just without even looking at the numbers, significantly more oysters per unit area. So we're hosting lots of oysters there. And then on the right, that image is really a simplified version of a length frequency histogram. And drawing your attention to the magenta line, you can see how we do have at oyster sanctuaries the existence of oysters greater than 100 millimeters, whereas we don't experience that in our culture planted and natural reefs. So sanctuaries are really hosting those larger individuals and in greater numbers, which translates to greater reproductive potential. And that you can kind of see in this image. Sanctuaries make up about 6% of the total reef area that we have in North Carolina. But we anticipate or calculate that they're producing approximately 25% of the larvae that are supplied system-wide. So only 6% of the area, but 25% of the larvae. So they're producing more larvae, we expect, than any other reef type we have. So quite important. I mentioned briefly before that we want these sanctuaries to last a really long time. This image just kind of gives you an idea. This is not respective. These individual data points aren't respective of any one particular site, but rather population density found on various material ages. And you can see that we've got beyond 15 years, a number of our data points, or at least the average oyster population exceeding perhaps 150 oysters per square meter on materials older than 15 years. So we consider that to be fairly successful. And we don't have any sanctuaries beyond about 26 years. So more data will come on that. Key points on the sanctuary system. We believe that oyster sanctuaries are supporting our oyster populations in Pamlico Sound, and they are functioning as what we call our larval factories. Really relatively small package, but producing lots of oysters. And most importantly, the Division of Marine Fisheries is tasked with managing fisheries. And so for that fact, and considering that, we do believe that oyster sanctuaries are important to helping subsidize the commercially harvested reefs in our state. But on culture planting, that I'll end with a handful of slides. Culture planting really is probably our biggest effort here in North Carolina. It consumes the majority of our time and really resources, and we allow it to because it is so important to helping our fisheries here. These reef sites, as a refresher, are relatively small, 1 to 3 acres on this image. We actually have been building some sites that are up to 10 acres here lately. We're exploring with some new management strategies. But they're really low relief, fairly easy to build, that continuous veneer, and we wash them off with our water monitors, basically a big fire hose on our various boats. We use a number of different materials, well, actually 2 primary materials. oyster shell being the preferred, and then a number 4, really golf ball sized limestone, marine limestone marl. Mentioned before, I'd show you some of our equipment. This is our fleet of vessels. We got 6 of them now, right? 2, 4, 6. Biggest one being this one in the biggest image is the Sir Ollie, now renamed the Oyster Creek. That's a 120 footer. We've removed the crane and done some other modifications. Actually, it's in the yard in South Carolina right now, receiving modifications. And we think that one will move about 150 tons of material a pop. We just bought it in the spring out of Houma, Louisiana. So we're excited to have it and put it to work starting in the spring. These other vessels have been around for a really long time. Some of them were built back in the 70s even, various retrofits and upkeep, but they're still workhorses for us and they're still working great. Some of the other equipment, and I'll just breeze through this. We've got some front end loaders and things that help us move materials around. In the coastal planning program, I like to think we've accomplished something, but I'm sure we'll be put to shame by some of these other states in their presentations. We've, since 1915 in the inception, or at least when we started recording culture planting officially in North Carolina, there's been more than 22 million bushels of material planted, thousands or perhaps even tens of thousands of sites developed since that time, over 100 years now. In the last 10 years, we've been building at a scale of about 40 to 50 acres per year. Combined, that adds up to just shy of 3 million bushels planted. One thing that I haven't really gotten into much detail on is funding and oscillations in funding. The vast majority of the funds to support this work come from our legislature, or what we call the General Assembly here in North Carolina. I'm sure most of you are aware of this or have similar circumstance in your state, but sometimes these environmental programs have a tendency to be political footballs. So in the last 10 years, we've experienced quite a bit of oscillation. It's gotten a lot better recently, thanks to some partners and other lobbying that occurs, but really we have experienced fairly significant oscillations in funding. But despite that, we've really streamlined our process. We've made our programs much more efficient, and therefore, on average, we've been able to deploy a consistently increasing number of bushels on average again in the last 10 years. So we're proud of that figure. The other nice thing is we've got a coastal recreational fishing license here that we've recently been allowed to use to help fund research that is directed, and those directed research grants help fill data gaps that we need to fill in order to inform our culture planning decisions. So that available funding has been really beneficial to us. This year and looking ahead, we're exploring some new culture planting strategies, such as rotational harvest management, or sort of a on and off, open and closed type of approach for certain reef sites. We're looking at construction methods, including spat on shell or remote setting. We're implementing new monitoring strategies in the culture planning program to help record critical metrics, such as population density, or help better record those metrics rather. I mentioned we do not have a stock assessment here in North Carolina, but we're interested in developing perhaps some type of pseudo stock assessment or full stock assessment. But in order to do so, obviously, we need solid data, and that new monitoring strategy will help generate some of those figures. We're working with the Nature Conservancy and NC State, North Carolina State University, to help develop methods to also collect additional stock assessment data. And then this year, we're on track to deploy what we consider to be a significant number of bushels, at least for our program. That is in here, it says 300,000. We're probably closer to 350 or 375,000 bushels, constructing about 50 acres of habitat. So there's a really wordy slide, and it's actually my last slide with anything on it. But I wanted to leave just some kind of food for thought and just leave you guys with an idea of some of the questions that we're asking here in North Carolina based on what we've experienced. And in our experience, we believe that the scientific monitoring specifically for culch planting needs to be improved here in our state, and maybe we can learn something from the other states as to how monitoring occurs there. And the reason we think that our monitoring needs to be made more rigorous or improved is because over time we've received less input from our commercial fishermen, which was really the driver of this program at the start. A lot of the folks we think are just getting old or losing interest in providing input. And so we need to gather information from somewhere to make informed decisions, and science is where we're looking. We're starting to see a major uptick in North Carolina in leasing, oyster leasing and oyster farming, and space being what it is, a limited resource. We're having some conflict or having to sort of work out where culch planting occurs versus where our leasing occurs. And when I say leasing, I'm talking about private leased bottom. These are private individuals that lease an area for their farming operation and develop on their own without the assistance of the state. Our legislature, General Assembly, is expressing increased interest in quantifying a return on investment. It's all about the dollar. And so we're trying to find ways to communicate that to our legislature. We're also experiencing the headwinds of permitting. Over the years, permits have become quite a bit more restrictive, and we're trying to find the delicate balance between honoring permit requirements while also performing the culch planting that we believe is a really good thing. Again, quantifying return on investment, what is the return, how much? We're also thinking about culch planting in terms of fisheries management. So our agency is a fisheries management agency, and we perform quite a bit of culch planting on an annual basis. But in our fishery management plan, it's really just sort of afterthought, if you will. There's not really any consideration of how the culch planting effort is benefiting our fishery. The linkage there, it hasn't been made. So we're working on trying to make that linkage and use culch planting as a strategy for fisheries management. And that's where I think we're considering new methods like a rotational harvest or certain management strategies in certain regions. The biggest point that I'm hoping maybe at some point we can start a conversation or at least some type of dialogue on as a group is the shell resource. And this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who's tried to buy shell lately, but there's not much of it, and it's getting really, really expensive. So certain areas of our state, specifically, shell is really the only material that we should be using for a variety of reasons, but we're having a really hard time finding it. And so maybe we can find a way to have a productive conversation on what we think shell is worth and where it's coming from. What are the other states doing to find and use shell? Because we're not interested in competing with anyone, but we would like to keep shell going back into the water, and we want to find the best way to do that here in North Carolina. I mentioned some headwinds with permitting that we're working through. We're trying to capitalize on our budget and budget oscillations. So if anyone has any thoughts on how to sort of best tackle oscillating budgets, we've been fortunate to be able to buy a lot of material in strong years where we've got a strong budget, and save that for years that we don't have a lot of budget, and that seems to be working well for us. And then finally, we're thinking of ways to incorporate contractors. I mentioned that we use contractors for our oyster sanctuary program because of the scale. And we're pretty much right now, we haven't been using contractors for our culture planning program, but we're pretty much at max capacity for the equipment that we have. And so we're thinking about incorporating contractors into that. And that's navigating new territory for us, at least for our culture planning program. So we love to talk with anybody who's doing anything like that. The real key points that I want to leave here or leave you all with is that in our experience, we found that it is crucial to our program to maintain strong relationships with the universities, the researchers providing our data or providing a lot of data, NGOs and stakeholders. We really are focused on applying emerging research to help with planning our projects, and with funding oscillations and environmental changes, we really are learning that it's important to remain flexible and open-minded when we're planning our future research and construction projects. So I know that was a lot of information, and I could probably stand here and talk for another 30 or 40 minutes, maybe longer, and get into all different kinds of detail, but I think that's enough to try to digest at this point. If anyone wants to call me or email me and just talk individually, I would love to do so. I welcome open discussion. My email's here on this slide, jason.peters@NCDENR, that's North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources. That was actually our old title. We're BEQ now, but same old email. My phone number is 252-808-8058. And if anybody has any questions, haven't really been following along in the chat, but I'm happy to answer or do my best to answer any questions you guys might have. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jason. In the chat, Kathy asked about the culch material used for your reefs, kind of what's been working best, what's been more successful, the different type of materials, concrete, those kind of things.
Sure, yeah.
And she asked specifically about the sanctuary reefs.
Yep, thanks, sorry.
Yep, so for really both programs, we've used a couple of different materials. The sanctuary program, we've experimented a lot more than we have in our culture planting program. For the most part, at our sanctuaries, the vast majority of the material that we use is limestone marl. It's riprap size, so football 4 to 12 inch, I think, is the tolerance there. But we've used things like crushed concrete. We've used recycled concrete pipe, manhole boxes, other precast concrete. We've used basalt. We've used granite. We've used reef balls. So what it really comes down to is two main things. Well, with any materials that we choose, and this kind of bleeds into our artificial reef program too, but with any materials that we choose, we're looking for stability and durability. And so that's the physical side of it. We don't want them to move. We don't want them to get buried. We have a permitted area. Obviously, we don't want them to leave, and that's the longevity piece of it from a physical perspective. But from a biological perspective, there's really two primary things that we're thinking about. The main one being salinity. In our sanctuary program, we're building in the Pamlico Sound system, and we've got a fairly consistent salinity gradient from east to west, high salinity in the east, low salinity in the west. As we get to those higher salinities, we start to see higher or greater presence of marine pests, a lot more grazers. There's just a lot more diversity in those places in terms of things competing for space. And so we have to get a little bit more specific with the materials that we use in those higher salinities. Marine limestone marl specifically, we found to host It's an endemic marine pest, the Cleona boring sponge. And there's some linkage there to reduced oyster mortality or oyster populations. And so, so we try to avoid using those materials in the higher salinity locations, and rather we'll lean on using granite, for example, or concrete that aren't necessarily as susceptible to those types of pests. The other thing beyond salinity is the complexity of the material unit. Limestone marl really being a fairly complex material. It's got lots of, if any of you have seen marine limestone marl up close, it's got lots of little cavities and nooks and crannies, and that's pretty good for oyster survival, at least in the early stages post-settlement. Contrast that with something like a piece of recycled concrete pipe, very smooth, really susceptible to grazing. And so what we use mostly, because of our salinity gradient, and where we see the most success, we're using limestone marl, but those are in more moderate salinity areas. Like I said, as we move east, we'll use things like concrete or granite.
Thanks, Jason.
Sure.
Craig was next, and then we'll go up to Erica. Craig had a question about the culch planting reefs. Why you said they disappear after a number of years. Why is that happening?
Sure.
I think I can answer that question if you're okay with that, Jason.
How about it, Abby?
Yeah. So like we said, the culch reefs are made out of pretty small pieces of material, either small golf ball sized limestone marl or oyster shells, and it's in a pretty thin veneer. So there's not a very thick layer of reef material there. So we see, and it depends on location where these reefs are located. We see over time, the reefs either get sedimented over, or they get sort of blown apart by currents and stuff. They also are reefs that get harvested, so they get really hit hard by harvest, and that really breaks the reefs apart. So with the new rotational harvest management program that we're talking about testing out, that new strategy would be in part to sort of combat the loss of reefs. So we would have larger culch reefs that open and close periodically, so that when they are closed, we can potentially re-scan them so that we can see like where the holes in the material are and what needs to be re-enhanced, so that we can make the reefs last much longer than they do in some areas. And in some areas, those reefs last much longer than others. There's really a pretty big gradient in the durability there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Abby. Erica?
Jason, thanks for your presentation, and Abby for being willing to share information with us. I appreciate in your talk, Jason, that you emphasized a few times that DMF is a fisheries management agency. So you're managing fisheries and thinking about oysters as a fishery. Has there been any thought in North Carolina for managing oysters for other fisheries that the agency has authority over?
There has, and I'll answer this at risk of sounding uninformed, because I am, but we do have the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan that's in place here. And essentially it focuses on habitats, and oysters are included in that, and considered for management as habitat and not so much as a fishery. And we're actually getting ready to reopen our fishery management plan for oysters, and part of the redevelopment of that plan may include some consideration of oysters as habitat, and then obviously the benefits that habitat offers to other fisheries. But as up until this date, really, it's been considered just for its fishery value. And we're starting to look at that a little differently now and more in the future.
Thanks, Jason. There's a couple other questions. Hallie asked, what for the high relief construction, what dictates which height you use?
Sure. The short answer is the Corps of Engineers. It's a navigational clearance issue, and where we build our sanctuaries, Pamlico Sound, we're in most cases limited to a 6-foot navigational clearance. So that's sort of the top end. We can't exceed that. As far as relief off of the bottom, it really depends on where we're building. We've got, I sort of briefly mentioned and alluded to low DO events and algal blooms in North Carolina, but in the southern portion of Pamlico Sound, where we build a lot of sanctuaries, we've got around the August, September, maybe early October timeframe, algal blooms that occur, we think related to intensive farming and runoff. But regardless, those algal blooms occur, and then the algae dies off and creates, just through bacterial decomposition, low DO water that can then affect our oyster reefs on the very bottom. And so in those deeper areas in the southwestern portion of Pamlico Sound, where we experience low DO, we build much higher relief reefs to kind of get them up out of that low DO water. Of course, we experience mortality on the lower portions of the reef, but the top ends of the reef tend to be a little more resilient in that regard. So it's really those two factors, is looking at the low DO, figuring how high do we build it, but then not exceeding the navigational clearance that we have to have by the Coast Guard. In other places, of course, the higher you go, the more material that takes and the more cost there too. And so that's more of a logistical feasibility consideration for us. So when we can build in places that aren't so deep, that don't experience that low DO, we may be only building to 1.5 to 2 foot relief, so long as we're not exceeding 6 feet of clearance from the surface. So again, it really depends on the location and the water depth of the area.
Thanks. And then Ben asked, do you utilize the HSI model for intertidal plantings?
Sorry, Jason. I was gonna say I could take this one too.
Sure.
So the HSI was originally built for the Oyster Sanctuary program before we modified a version of it for the Culch program. So because it was built for the Sanctuary program, it only encompasses the Pamlico Sound area right now. Building a new one to include those southern areas where we have more intertidal reefs is sort of a future goal, along with many other things. As of right now, the way we decide where to plant reefs in those intertidal areas, there's a number of factors that go into it. A major one is just looking at past Culch planting and where those went. And so we'll sort of select areas near older reefs that we have data on that we know did fairly well. And so we'll go down there and do a pretty comprehensive site investigation before sending that out for public comment.
Thanks.
There are some other siting tools that we use in this more southern intertidal dominated areas that are not the habitat suitability index model, and I failed to mention, but those siting tools are really focused on actually lease planning and intended for lease holders or prospective lease holders. But the data that's included in those siting tools is also beneficial to us in our culture planning program. So we lean on some of that too, and it's all the same stuff for the most part, looking at water quality, bottom type, things of that nature.
And then the last question is from Carolina. Is the harvest strict to market size oysters, or can harvesters transport oysters onto their leases?
Very good question. For the most part, it is it's only legal size. So we build culture planting reefs with really no additional management applied to them. beyond just the statewide harvest season. And so anybody can have access to them. Anybody can go in and harvest oysters so long as they meet that. In North Carolina, it's a 3-inch minimum size. We do have a mechanism here for a relay, oyster relay, but it's not really used very often. And it's typically for places where waters are temporarily polluted, and those oysters can be moved into unpolluted areas and then allowed to sort of purge themselves and then be harvested later. Leaseholders can harvest under that 3-inch size, but that's not on public bottom, and that's not necessarily related to our culture planning program.
Thanks, Jason. Charlie Robertson asked regarding the 25% of the larval oyster recruitment is supplied by sanctuary reefs that only make up the 6%. He asked, can you elaborate briefly on how it was determined that 25%?
Sure. Yeah, as a back of the envelope method, and really that's paraphrased from a paper that I didn't write, so I'll do my best with it. But it's a back of the envelope method where we looked at per capita fecundity by size. We looked at population density and length frequency, and then so sort of applying that length frequency, or applying rather the per capita fecundity at length to a length frequency, we were able to scale up to a reproductive potential per unit area, and then looked at the total area of our reef sites and then scaled up from there. So probably quite a bit of error included in that. But even within that margin of error, it's significantly more than 6% of the larval production. So.
Thanks. Ty Lindsay had his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you, Ted. Great presentation, Jason. I appreciate it. Very interesting. I have lots of questions, but I'll limit myself. On your sanctuaries, we kind of talked about build it and they will come. Is it, you do anything to seed one of those sanctuaries, or is it just put the material out and you can usually rely on natural recruitment?
Yeah, the latter. We do experiment or have experimented with what we call seeded materials or spat on shelf per se, or remote setting. But for the most part, we haven't found a need for that. And just given the cost alone, we don't see where we get, the bang isn't there for the buck. We rely on that natural recruitment, and we've been successful with that. So we're typically, we consider ourselves to be substrate limited rather than larval limited.
Thanks. And then Todd asked a little bit related regarding seeding. If you could just describe the new permit that allows leaseholders to move their unused or extra oysters onto restoration sites, and if that is a potential for, kind of seeding more reefs, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, Todd would ask me the hardest question. So thanks, Todd. And I may have to defer to some of our aquaculture people on that. I'm not super familiar with the new permit process for private leases. So unfortunately, I don't know that I'd be able to answer that one accurately. Sorry, Todd, but I can look into it and get back with you on that for sure.
I think this is similar to what you've seen across the country with Nature Conservancy and Pew working on the SOAR concept, especially during COVID, when you had a lot of oyster farms who had a lot of stock that we weren't able to sell. And so there was the opportunity to, I apologize, TNC folks or Pew folks, please feel free to jump in, or other people who've been involved with it. But it basically gave oyster growers funding to move those seed oysters onto reefs for restoration. And so North Carolina has developed a permit that allows that to occur here. I don't think it's been utilized very heavily, but that is something that, may be a tool in the future. Do one more question, and we'll try to let you guys go. Craig, go ahead.
Mine's not a question per se. I wanted to thank you guys again. This is good. I have 1,000 questions and comments about how we do things on New Jersey compared to how you guys do things. And I think you'll have a lot of them when I give a presentation on our stuff. So maybe at the end, we can kind of fit it all together, because there's a couple things you guys do. I'm like, oh, that sounds good. And then I'm like, well, maybe they should try what we do, but I like what you do here. So I think it could be good.
That sounds
So
great.
thank
And that's exactly the kind of discussion we were hoping we would have. So I look forward to that.
Thanks, Craig. Abby, do you have anything else you want to add?
I don't think so. Other than, I'm really looking forward to hearing other state strategies and how they deal with, these unique issues that only come with oyster restoration.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and Craig, and your comment, and Ty and others from last week, just the ability to share the information and ask these questions and get input from everybody else. That is kind of what we really had hoped for through this kind of establishment of these seminars and this network. And so moving forward, what we'd love to have is, we've got the 2 remaining seminars. We're trying to limit presentations per state. So if there's a nonprofit who is partnering with a state agency, if you guys can kind of join forces in a presentation, that would be wonderful. But if you haven't signed up, we'd love to hear from you. Jason mentioned that there were a lot of questions we posed to each program, and his thought was to give kind of a summary of the program. He and Abby would do that, and then answer some of these questions in kind of a poll form. And you're welcome to do that, and we'll share that with you all as well. We're creating sort of a resource area where you can go and see all the questions, the different presentations, as well as the list of questions and things like that, and other resources. So we're working on creating that, and we'll share that with you as soon as possible. Laura, you had a question?
Yes, sorry, I was mute. Do you find, I was just curious, Jason, if you find that the sport fishermen are very supportive of these sanctuary reefs, are they allowed to fish, hook and line fish on these sanctuary reefs?
Yeah, great question. Yes, is the short answer. Yes and yes. The only restriction that we have in oyster sanctuaries is no oyster harvest. Fishing, recreational fishing, all allowed. And actually, you can see on this last picture, all the sheep's head there. The sport fishermen love that. In the summertime, quite a few trout, red drum. Fishing is really great here, and the sport fishermen love it and benefit from it. So a lot of support from those folks.
Thanks,
And
Jason.
sorry, I have one other question, sort of the economics of it. Has the economics of the cultured reefs been analyzed? The economic benefit to the state and to the oyster fishers versus the cost that the state puts into mulching the fish reefs?
So it's one of the things that I think we really need to better hone in on here in North Carolina. We've tried to tackle that question from a bunch of different angles over the last several years, and I'm not convinced that we've got a really great answer for that. There's a number of studies that have been produced in the last decade or so that aim to quantify the value, either just the straight market value, but then also the value ecologically, the dollar value ecologically. And then obviously we can compare that with what we put into it, but really the cost benefit analysis of it on a per acre or a per dollar, we just don't have that figure yet. But if any other states are producing those types of estimates, we'd love to see how you're doing it, and maybe we can replicate that here in North Carolina.
Thanks very much.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, again, Jason, Abby. So again, if you would like, the idea is that these seminars provide an opportunity for us to share a lot of information so that, our limited time together in December, we can actually spend a lot of time discussing things, looking at the key topics versus just kind of listening to each other. So the more we can get out through these seminars, the better. But again, if you don't have time, we understand. But if you are able to sign up, you can also, we'll share it so you can, if you want to provide written answers, that's fine too. But anything you can provide beforehand is very valuable. We kind of use the host prerogative this time. We gave Jason and Abby a fair amount of time, which is wonderful. We'll try to, if we have multiple presenters, we may go down to 30 minutes. But again, it's a lot of information. I know we all have lots of questions. And so we'll try to, build up that momentum going into these other seminars as well as the meeting. So, please look forward to, more information from us coming from Georgia and I regarding the meetings, the resources. Again, if you have any contacts you think that, and the invite list, we'll also share that with you all so you can make sure that we aren't missing any key folks. And so we'll share all that with you all as well. But thank you again for your time. We know everyone's very busy and we appreciate your questions and input. And we really appreciate Jason and Abby taking the time to give us the presentation.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thanks very much. Very interesting presentation.
Yes, thank you.
All right. You survived.
Yeah, that wasn't too bad. I know I talked forever and ever, so I apologize for that, but
That wasn't, I didn't think that was too long at all.
No,
Yeah.
I thought it was fine.
Yeah, that was great. And there were a lot of questions. So that took up a lot. I think your timing was fine.
I think you're still recording if this is the version we're going to be sharing out.
Oh yeah, that's true.